Hello, welcome to the new online version of Human Resources Management. Since the school's been closed, we're just trying to catch up. So I'm going to record this video. It's basically just going to be a narration through the PowerPoint for Chapter 8 so that we can make up for the class that we missed on March 24th. We're not going to be able to meet for the rest of the semester. Hopefully starting the class on March 31st. We're going to cover a couple of chapters. I hope to be able to have it up and running for Zoom or some other live version of online course. If it doesn't work, we're just going to do the same thing that this video is, at least for the short term, until we can get it running. I know there's a lot of demands on the system, so we have to make sure that everything works out. As I stated in one of the announcements in Blackboard, the test is going to be made up at some point. I just have to get it up online. You'll have some flexibility in when you can take it, but there will be a time limit when you do the test. I have to remake it, obviously, and then get it ready for online usage. I've been working from home for, I think, the last 14, 15 days in a row. Didn't shave because I don't have to go anywhere. So, but this is kind of the new normal for the time being. So we're just going to get through this class, and you'll get some updates regarding how to view future classes coming up. So enjoy. Okay, we're going to cover Chapter 8. Developing Employees for Future Success. This chapter was originally going to be covered in the class of March 24th that was canceled. So if you look along with your PowerPoint, we're going to be covering employee development, which is on the second slide. We mentioned before in class that training and development are two different things. Training is really to focus on getting something done. If a person or an employee doesn't have the capacity to do a particular skill that is necessary to complete the job, training can take them from the point where they were unable to do it to the point where they are able to accomplish it. Development is more with an eye towards the future, and it can combine formal education, experiences on the job through training programs that are provided by the employer, relationships with other people that you work with, and you can do some other things to figure out who may be the best prospective employees that could step into another position. We mentioned that previously regarding succession planning. Oftentimes, if you offer development to employees, they will view it as a benefit because it kind of shows that the employer is looking at the employee as someone that can actually have some value, and it's going to be viewed as an investment in the employee, so it can help with the overall enthusiasm and commitment of employees to make sure that they can stay working with them. It can also reduce turnover. Development is also important when you're talking about changing to new jobs. We're not talking about leaving the organization. We're talking about keeping someone in their position where they have to be either transferred to another location or they could be potentially promoted or switched over to a different job as is needed. What they need to do, what their responsibilities are, what their requirements are. If you go to slide 3, training versus development, we already mentioned a little bit, but the focus of training is to get people skilled in what they need to do right now, whereas development is something that they need to do in the future. As far as work experience goes, training doesn't really rely on what you already know. What we're trying to do is get you some information that we don't know. Development can include a lot of work experience and partnering somebody up with a senior manager, for example, to get them the experience that they need in order to learn how to do the new job that they're preparing for. The goal of training, as noted, is for the current job, whereas we're preparing for a future job or changes that need to be implemented in terms of development. Typically, participation in training for a particular job is required. Development is more where the employer will target people that they think have high potential, and rather than forcing them to take a promotion, for example, it is something that would be more voluntary. The word protean means subject to change or transformation. And when you're looking at careers in today's workplace, a lot of careers are actually referred to as protean careers, something that means that you could enter one field and over the time that you're involved in it, technology, globalization, other things can put pressure on it to change. So you could end up 10 or 20 years later doing an entirely different job, even though you're still in the same field. It also may mean that you are required to actually switch careers into a different field. The way the economy has been progressing, the way jobs have been changing, means that people may need to be versatile in order to get different types of skills that would be in demand so that they could continue to perform in their chosen career path. We talked about in class a little bit about Moore's Law and the impact of technology, and that definitely has an impact on why these careers are like this. 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, it wouldn't have been very unusual to get a job and remain in the same job for the duration of your career. And the things that you had to do, the skills and tasks that you had to have, were very unlikely to change simply because there wasn't the same rate of change that we see today. If you remember Moore's Law, and I'll provide a link for a video that'll explain it, it basically is the theory that starting in the 1960s, technology would basically speed up and improve about every year and a half to 2 years, everything would be doubling. So if you had a computer processor, it would be twice as powerful, it would have twice as much memory. That results in exponential growth and technology changes. When the 90s turned into the 2000s and businesses became used to doing things like going online and having remote communications, much like what we're doing here by having the classes online, which was something that was not possible just a few years ago. That's really due to Moore's Law. And if you were doing a career in the 70s and 80s and continued into the 90s and 2000s, you would have had to have learned these new skills in order to be able to do it. It can actually become much more of a requirement particular to a particular job. So if I'm a lawyer, I'm going to have to learn how to do online research. When I was in law school, it was all libraries. So we went in and we had books and we had an entire process to do research. All of that has completely changed. So in the course of one career, you may need to pick up a whole lot of skills. Training can help with that, but also the development issue can arise for people who move into new jobs, which whether your job changes or not, if you're moving into a new job, you're going to need to learn new skills. In the big picture, if you want to remain marketable, you're going to always have to develop new skills. And that means if you're moving through your career path and become a manager, being a manager is a totally different set of skills than it would be if you were a line employee. On slide 5, they have a little graphic here touching upon the topics we're going to speak to in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. Interpersonal relationships, the way that you interact with people at work, is part of the way that you can develop. You can have formal education. You can have job experiences, just doing the job on your own. And then assessment, which is when your employer will actually look to see how you're developing, how you're moving along, how you're employing the skills and abilities that you have and applying it to the job in question. So formal education can include workshops. These are typically run probably by the training program, even though it may not be training itself. It would be part of the development program that a training department would offer. They would give you a workshop about how to be a manager. I think the last class that we had on the ground, we covered, I think I showed you a couple of things from my training group where we provided workshops where people sat down and talked about what it was like to be a manager. That would be an example of this type of work. You would allow the prospective managers to ask questions of people with more experience. There could be some short courses and lectures that would be provided as well. Simulations can also be included. We saw the video with the Qantas flight training simulation. That is what a simulation is, but in this case, we'd be talking about putting someone into a situation that they are not used to. So if you're moving from a line worker to a management position, we could say, here's a problem, you're now the manager, how do you address this? There's a problem with an employee, there's a problem with getting supplies, how would you resolve it? And the simulation would be designed to give people the skills necessary to be able to figure it out. Business games are good, but I think I mentioned in the training section, it can be very difficult and time consuming to create good games. You would basically look at a case study of something that happened, analyze it, you'd have several options that people could choose, and then you would discuss why they chose a particular path and whether that was the right way to go or the wrong way to go, and examine the strengths and weaknesses of each decision. Experiential programs are programs where you would actually be put into an actual job. These can also include things off-site too that are not necessarily geared toward a particular skill, but rather working with other people. So we could take someone out on a weekend trip or someplace off-site and do something that is totally unrelated to the workplace. But the skills that would be learned is how to get along with people, how to be a leader, and some other skills that would be necessary and important. The term experiential actually has the word experience in it, and that's what the focus of this type of training is. You immerse someone in a situation where they can get real-time feedback as to how they're performing. You can meet with customers as well. So if you want to be a manager, your main goal is going to be making sure that your employees are satisfying your consumers or your customers. If you meet with customers, you can ask them questions about how did we do? It's very difficult sometimes to gather enough information. In order to make decisions, you need to have information on which to base those decisions, and it can be very difficult to get that information. If customers are willing to talk to you personally, you can ask them what their experience is like and how you could have improved to be a little bit better the next time you go through the same process. A lot of times companies rely on surveys. That's not a bad way to collect a lot of data from a lot of people, but it's also a good idea if someone is actually willing to talk to you, say it's a business partner that you have that you're selling supplies to, they may be willing to talk to you to educate you or for your education, for your edification, to be able to figure out how to do your job better because they have a vested interest in you doing your job well. And as noted, some of the bigger companies that have the ability to hire staff, they can have training and development centers on their own. Sometimes, as we noted in the training chapter, you may have to farm that out. But if you're really looking at something where you're trying to get people developed for a particular job within your organization, if you have the capacity to do so, it's a good idea to tailor all of these types of workshops and simulations to the job that you're doing, which may preclude someone from outside really having a good understanding of how that works. The assessment is to try to get as much information from employees about how they do their job, how they communicate with one another, what kind of skills they have. You can get it from the employees directly. You can ask other people. We talked about 360 type of assessments. Talk to the customers. You can basically talk to everybody and figure out, how well they're doing. The employees that actually are assessed at having the greatest level of potential would be the ones that you would probably tap to become involved in an employee development program, which they would volunteer to do, but it would be on the basis of giving that extra effort and that extra motivation to those people that are already capable of doing it. You probably don't want to spend the time trying to develop someone that has been assessed as not being a particularly good employee or someone that doesn't look like they're going to be capable of moving up to a higher level position. You can do psychological profiles, and we've talked about testing before. A lot of this involves testing that you can purchase. You probably wouldn't want to develop a true psychological profile with your own staff unless you have someone with an industrial psychology background. We already talked about doing things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I've already mentioned that I don't think it's that great of a tool, but it is still a tool that is in wide use, and it may help, at least as a point of discussion, help to figure out what type of people fit the profile for the courses that you want to give them to develop them into the positions that are available or may become necessary. DISC is also something that some organizations use. It is a third-party commercial product that you can purchase. It's basically a testing assessment that looks for things like different types of behaviors regarding whether you have a dominant personality, whether you're an influencer, whether you're steady at your job, and whether you possess conscientiousness, which is essentially the ability to stick with your job, do it well, and do it accurately. That's basically what DISC stands for: dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. So you can use that assessment in order to determine whether or not someone party that's been targeted for further development. You can have assessment centers as well. You could have leaderless group discussions, which basically means you let employees sit around and talk about things to try to learn from one another. And then again, you could do a 360 feedback. I think we talked about this before. It's called a 360 feedback because there are 360 degrees in a circle. Often when assessments are done, it's usually a manager assessing an employee. A 360 would allow a manager to assess the employee, but also to be assessed by their employee, as well as their manager and their peers, so they can find out what it looks like in terms of their performance from everybody that they're dealing with. Your employees that you're targeting for development could also go through a 360 feedback as a way to assess whether or not they're someone that would really be a person that you would want to target for further development. I'm just going to skip over slide 8 quickly. You can just read through that and the reference in the book. Different ways to approach employee development. You can begin an assessment that puts them into a team group. Like, again, this is related to things we just talked about in some earlier slides. Just get as much feedback, see how they respond, see how engaged they are in order to pick the appropriate people for development. Job experiences can really go a long way in getting people developed for a particular task that they need to do. A lot of development does occur through job experience. This happens somewhat on its own. What the key here is, though, you would want your staff to merely not stumble through a day or a week or a month or a year at their job. You might want to have more of a way about how they should be looking at their experiences, learn from it, and then employ the things that they're doing. You could have a check-in with them to say, how was last week? What types of things came up? How did you address them? But the experience itself, everybody learns from doing their job. The longer you do something, hopefully, the better you'll be at it. If you have more of a kind of an encouragement where people will be explaining to you when something happens, analyze it in a particular way, you can make job experiences that will arise be a lot more effective in terms of how you can develop someone in their job. Job assignments are a way to get experience. So if you're doing one particular job and I want to get you ready to do another job, maybe a management job, maybe I'll put you in charge of another unit. Maybe I'll move you geographically someplace else. Interpersonal relationships, we could probably assign you a coach or a mentor, which is something that's going to come up later. By dealing with people, again, it's just an opportunity for you to develop your skills by getting information from somebody who's done it before. Job assignments include job enlargement, which means basically giving someone more tasks to do. Maybe before we make you a full-blown manager, we make you responsible for a couple of projects, or we have you serve as a temporary manager to someone that you did not previously have report to you. Job rotation is simply taking you from one job into another. These are the same type of things that happen when we were talking about in earlier chapters to keep the job interesting for people who are on jobs like assembly lines and manufacturing, just to keep the job interesting. The same thing does happen here, but the purpose of job rotation in this instance is not necessarily to just relieve someone of boredom. It's to expand their capacity to understand how other people do their job. Because if you're trying to get someone within your organization to be ready to be a manager, having a better understanding about how the entire organization works together is going to be a great advantage. Obviously, a promotion is something that could be a great way to get some development. Hopefully, it would go hand in hand so that the experience of being promoted would be tailored so that you would have some level of development to give you the skill set to be able to move more seamlessly into that position. Downward moves are usually not employed. It could be helpful if it's viewed as a non-punishment. If I have to move you into a position in another branch of our organization and I want you to be the manager there, but you don't know how the job is done, I could actually hopefully keep your pay the same and put you in a lower level position so you can see what it means to do that job, because you'd have a better understanding about how to manage it when you know what your employees will actually be going through. We could also send you off for temporary assignments, either with another organization within our company, or we could loan you out to somebody that we're partnering with in a joint venture. Sabbaticals, typically that's usually reserved for academia, where a professor may take a semester off or a year off to go and learn new things, develop new skills. You can do that on a shorter term in a commercial structure as well, where we could give someone the opportunity to just go out and try to learn a few things over a couple of weeks, take courses, go visit some other companies, go to another country, see how things happen there. The next slide I'm going to just put up there for a second, but then I'm going to skip over to get to the details. Approaches to employee development. One of the things that we can do is move someone out to an overseas branch, for example, or somewhere outside the country or within the country. The United States is a pretty big place. If you're in Boston, we could send you to Minnesota, we could send you to Washington State, or we could send you, abroad. Interpersonal relationships. I already mentioned mentoring and coaching. Mentoring and coaching are a little bit different. A mentor is somebody who has a lot of experience. They're usually someone who's a highly successful senior employee, and they will basically take a protege, the employee that we've targeted for development, under their wing, and they could just sit down and say, hey, once a week, once a month, on a regular basis, have lunch. They could just answer questions. They could give advice regarding situations that may develop. Coaching is a little bit more hands-on. It comes from the sports world, so it's more telling you how to do something, as opposed to a mentor probably being more of a senior person who's giving you higher level advice. Coaching would be somebody who could be at your level or works with the employee to help motivate you, develop your leadership skills, etc. Coaches can also work one-on-one with an employee, provide feedback, help employees learn for themselves, tell them how to find the information so they don't have to continually come back and ask people for it. If they can find it themselves, it'll make it a more efficient way of doing their job. And a coach could also kind of slip into the mentorship position as well, depending on their level of experience and knowledge. So systems for career management. Career management steps include data gathering, feedback, goal setting, and action planning and follow-up. So what data gathering really revolves on is that you want to focus on the competencies that you need for your career success. What types of skills do you need in the future that you don't currently have right now? Feedback is somebody giving you an honest assessment of how your job is going, how well you're performing. It's important for the employer to maintain confidentiality, especially if this is outside of the formal assessment program. You want to look at success factors, strengths, weaknesses, areas that you can improve. Just letting people know, these are the things that you've been doing right, keep doing them. These are the things that you're not doing so great, here's a way to fix it. Goal setting should be something that is in conjunction between management and the employee. You really want them, the coaches, the mentors, the employee, and management involved to figure out, what do you want? What do we want of you? How can we work together to give you the competencies that you need in order to develop, to be able to fulfill the position that we have in mind for you? Action planning is really taking the goals that you've set and figuring out how you're going to accomplish it. It's taking the plan that you've set up through the data gathering, the feedback, and the goal setting, and then putting it into play, whether it's through job enlargement or any of the other things that we were talking about. Feedback out of these four is probably the one that's going to be happening all the time. I mean, data gathering and goal setting, they will always be modified, but feedback will be coming through every step. So one of the things you can do for data gathering through the self-assessment, we already talked about the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs test. There's another commercially available test where you can do the Strong-Campbell Interest Inventory, which is basically an assessment of what type of skills they have. Feedback from employers, we've already talked about a little bit, so I'm going to skip to the next slide. I'm not going to go over this slide in the video, but you can feel free to read through it in more detail. Slide 19, goal setting. What type of job do you want to have? This is a good thing for you to be doing as students as well. Where do you want to be in 5 years? What kind of job do you want to get when you graduate? What type of positions do you want to get? What type of skill do you need to be able to apply for that position? What type of workplace do you want to have? Do you want to be in a particular country? Do you want to work in an office? Do you want to have the ability to work from home and have telework capabilities? How much travel is involved? What type of skills do you need to be able to pick it up? Action planning on 19, I've kind of already talked over a little bit. So I'm going to move on. There's a career development plan on slide 20. I'm not going to go through line by line, but there's probably a version of this in your book. And it's just something that you could do as a worksheet to go through the process of developing a career plan. Slide 21, they refer to the glass ceiling. That's basically a metaphor for groups of people that have probably faced discrimination in the past. It's referred to as a glass ceiling because if you are in a building, and typically if you want to move upstairs where the management is, you can see where it is, but you can't actually get there because there's some type of roadblocks. Like I said, it's usually referred to in a situation for, say, gender discrimination where women are not promoted as frequently as men, or people from other backgrounds, whether it be various nationalities or other backgrounds, where they're having trouble. But it can also be caused by simply a lack of skill. You may want to be able to move into a position, but you can't get there. And the thing that's blocking you may not be discrimination. It may be a lack of ability because you haven't been developed to the extent that you should be. Succession planning does not refer to success, but to succeed someone is to replace them. So as an HR manager, what you would do is you would look at everybody in your organization through a lot of the skills that we were looking at, a lot of the data that we've collected from the previous chapters that we were talking about, figure out who's going to be the high potential people and get them geared up so that if a CEO leaves or if a manager of a particular area leaves, our search time can be reduced dramatically. And higher level positions are usually more difficult to fill. If you've got someone in-house that has been prepped and trained and developed appropriately, they'll be able to just get promoted from within, and then you'll only have to backfill their position, which is likely not to be as senior, and you would have a quicker time and an easier time of fulfilling or backfilling that job. On slide 23, we go through the whole series of things that you need to look for to develop a succession plan. Identify the positions. These are usually critical positions that if somebody left, either because they quit, they retired, or they became ill or some other reason, you would want to make sure that those positions are highlighted as being targeted for a succession plan because they're critical and they need to be filled. Figure out which employees might be good candidates to take those jobs, figure out what the job requirements are, measure the employee potential, review with that employee to figure out what type of development needs they would have to address to be able to step in if needed. And then you could tie that into the HR systems that we talked about before, where you have that online computerized database that links in all of your HR processes together. You give the feedback to the employee, you measure how effective your plan is. Have you done succession planning before? Did you actually exercise it? Have you placed an employee that had been targeted for that position before? And were they successful when they were placed in that job? If they're not, you may need to do a little bit more research and collect some data to find out why it didn't work out as well as you might have anticipated. Development-related changes on slide 24, we're talking about dysfunctional managers. Just the word dysfunctional probably implies that it's not a particularly good thing to have. This is someone who may have competence in the skills, but they are missing some elements in their interpersonal behaviors that make it difficult for others to work with them. These are also referred to as toxic bosses. When I taught organizational behavior and design, which is a class that many of you may be taking, they talk about the various types of personalities, psychopathy, sociopathy. These are things where people just have inherent flaws in their ability to work with other people. Neurotic people tend to focus on things that aren't really productive. They tend to blame others. They don't give success or they don't give credit for success where it is due. The types of behaviors that you could be looking for is insensitivity to others. They're not really empathetic. They don't really care if someone is having a crisis outside of work. They're only focusing on whether they did the job correctly, and they're not really looking at the person as a whole. Dysfunctional managers also have an inability to be a team player, meaning that they don't function particularly well. This is an example of somebody who would take credit for someone else. That would immediately be a disincentive for employees that report to them to be creative, because why would you be creative if your boss is going to steal your idea and not give you any credit for it? They tend to be arrogant. They tend to escalate conflict instead of resolving it, or they tend to avoid conflict and let it fester and become worse than it would otherwise be if it had been addressed. They also may not be able to meet their business objectives, not necessarily due to their competency, but because they just can't get the employees to do the work that they want because the employees don't view them as someone that they can trust. Dysfunctional behavior also includes the inability to adapt to change. Human beings typically don't love change. They fall into routines. They typically do the same type of things. They go to the same restaurants. They wake up, they have the same routine. When you show up at work, as we mentioned with Moore's Law and with globalization, there could be changes coming every couple of weeks, every couple of months, every couple of years. And managers that are not capable of adapting and evolving and getting their employees to buy into change are going to be a very big problem. That leads us to the summary, so you can review the summary slides. I'm going to post a few things on Blackboard with some links that could further supplement this. The online version of this is going to be a lot quicker because we don't have a lot of give and take. I'm hoping to be able to move to more of a classroom session, but we needed to catch up on this, so I wanted to make sure this information was available to you. Thank you.